These are the worked out solutions for the front side of the study guide for Algebra B, Quarter 3, Test 4. And looking at the first three problems, it looks like we'll be graphing some quadratics. So let's take a look at our first one here. We've got a quadratic function. Remember, anytime you see that f of x, that just means y. It's the same exact thing. And so what we need to do first is figure out where our vertex is. So I'm going to start with the negative b over 2a formula, and it gives us our axis of symmetry. So when I go ahead and substitute those numbers in that I have negative 8 over 2 times negative 1. Remember, this minus sign is the same as negative 1. And so that makes a negative 8 over negative 2, which just makes 4. So I'm going to take that 4 and I'm going to substitute it into these x's right there. And so I have negative 1 times by 4 squared, and then plus 8 times by 4, and then a minus 12. And so when we go ahead and do a little bit more work, I've got a negative 16 plus 32 minus 12. And so remember what I said, always opposite signs for the first two terms, and one is double the other. So we end up with 16 minus 12, which just makes 4. So the y value is 4, the x value is 4. So 4 comma 4, that's where we're going to start this graph. So over 4 spaces, up 4. So 1, 2, 3, 4. And so there's our first point. And then from there, we look at the parent graph. The parent graph is just a negative 1 times by x squared. So when you square 1, you're going to multiply by negative 1, and it equals negative 1. So if you go to the left 1 space or right 1 space, that's the x direction here, is from the vertex, you're going to multiply by a negative, and that forces you down. And so that's why we end up always going down 1 space from the vertex when we have a negative 1 in front of the x squared term. When we square 2, we get 4. But then you have to multiply by a negative 1, which gives us negative 4. So I'm going over 2 spaces to the right or to the left, down 4. So I should have a point on the x-axis. And there it is, our graph. And so that's what you'll be doing for the first problem, is just graphing a quadratic similar to that one. Next one, a little bit different. Has a 4x squared. That's what's different about it. We have our axis of symmetry formula we're doing, negative b, which is negative 8 over 2 times by 4, which will end up giving us a negative 1 in this case. Take that negative 1 and substitute it in for these x's, remembering that when we're trying to find the value, you know you're doing something right if you are getting opposite signs, but one double the other for the first two terms. And so watch for that. And we go ahead and do some work here. We got a positive 4 plus, or actually I'll just write minus 8 minus 2. And we know we're doing something right here because opposite signs one double the other. Negative 4 minus 2 makes negative 6. So our vertex, negative 1, negative 6, that's where we're starting. 1 to the left, down 6. So 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Right there. And then from there we just follow what the parent graph tells us. It's a 4x squared, so it's going to go up fairly sharply. When you square 1, you get 1, but then you multiply by 4, you're going up 4 spaces. So over 1 up. 1, 2, 3, 4. Always from the vertex. And that matches our y-intercept. See, our y-intercept is negative 2, and that's where I'm at. So right opposite of this point, there's another one right there. And then if I go over 2 spaces, I'm going to end up squaring that, getting 4 times by 4 gives me 16. So 16 spaces up, so I go over 1, or actually over 2, and I'm going up 16 spaces. So that's 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16. So right there's our next point. And then there's one right opposite of it, and the same number of spaces from the axis of symmetry. And so from there we'll just sketch that graph, and that's what it looks like. Well, the next one is one where we don't have the x term. When there's no x term, that means that the vertex is negative 2 in this case. It's the point where it crosses the y-axis. So we could just go down to negative 2 right now. And then we're using that axis, that parent graph, y equals 1/2 x squared. So if you square 1, we get 1, but then we got to multiply by 1/2. And so that's why I'm only going up 1/2 space. So instead of writing y there, write 1/2. And then from there, I'll go over 1 up 1/2 space. Make sure you're showing that you're really up 1/2 space. If I square 2, I get 4 times by 1/2. I end up with 2. So over 2 spaces brings me up just only 2. And so I have those 2 points, and then I sketch that graph. And so it's a little bit wider when we're multiplying the x squared term by 1/2. Well, the next few problems are asking us to solve quadratic equations. Now, we've learned a few different methods to solve. However, I would stick with factoring for these three. They'll all be able to be solved by factoring. And whenever it asks you to solve a quadratic, if they don't specify the method, I'd always start with factoring, because factoring is the fastest method. And so this one's set up for factoring because it's already set equal to 0. So I'm just finding the numbers that multiply to make 12, but subtract to make 4. So I'm thinking of positive 6 and a negative 2. Always check those outside and inside terms. You just mentally check them. Negative 2x, 6x, yeah, that makes 4x. And then from there, just go ahead and set those factors equal to 0 and come up with those 2x intercepts. So here we're having to subtract the 6. Here we're having to add the 2. Now again, if you want to use completing the square, you want to use quadratic formula, that's fine. But factoring will work with these three problems, and it's a fast method. I'd always recommend trying factoring first because it doesn't take too much time, and if you see it right away, it makes the problem go a lot faster. So x and x make x squared. Numbers that multiply to make 9 but subtract to make negative 8 are going to end up being a 9 and a 1. And you check those outside and inside terms in order to get them to subtract to make an 8x, a negative 8x that is. We need more negatives than positives. So the negative sign's got to go here with the 9, plus sign with the 1. Well, from there you're just taking that both expressions, setting them equal to 0 and solving. So you add 9 to all sides on this one. Here we're going to end up subtracting the 1, and we end up with our two answers, 9 and negative 1. Well, the next problem, we've got to do a little bit of work first. I'm going to move these two terms over. Whenever you move a term, notice that I'm using an opposite operation. Here I'll add the 6. I'm going to add 6 on this side. And then once I do that, I'm going to put it in descending order. X squared minus 5x plus 6 all equals 0. And then from there, I can go ahead and factor. So I move the other two terms because it's easier for me to factor with the x squared term being positive. So it's x and x, numbers that multiply to make 6, but add to make negative 5 are going to be a negative 3 and a negative 2. They have to be the same sign because they multiply to make a positive and add to make a negative, so they're both negative. Well, from there, you're just taking the two factors and setting them equal to 0, and then just doing opposite operations. And that'll give you your answer. So over here, ending up adding 2 to all sides, so we get it. 3 and 2 are the two x-intercepts. Part 2 will have the last 3 problems, so check that one out.